I think this is a good place to close because I do think this is our bedrock disagreement. I think you look at me, you look at the folks you see as engaging in identity politics, which is something other people do, but not you. And you see tribalism. You see, on my part, a social justice warrior tribalism of some sort or another, someone who's, looking for evidence of racism and bigotry. I look at our society and I see a society that even now, on every study we basically run, shows huge racial bias. I mean, I look at a study done just a couple of years ago showing that if you send employers a resume and everything is equal except for the name, one name is African American coded and another name is European coded, you get 50% fewer callbacks for African Americans. I look at evidence that when African Americans go into the hospital, they do not get treatment for pain at the same rates as white Americans because doctors do not believe them. They think they're trying to scam the drugs or something. I see us as a society that is not 100 years or 1,000 years or 10,000 years away from a long legacy of not just racism, but violence and oppression of the worst kind. A society where we did things that even now to just go through them, it chills you. But that was like 50 years ago, and some of it still goes on today. Yeah, that's the society I see. Doesn't mean I couldn't be talked out of it. Doesn't mean that if we get evidence in 25 or 50 years that, of genetic discoveries we have not had yet, that I couldn't change my view. But right now, when I look at that evidence, and I'll tell you, Sam, like I do so with integrity and trying to think through the right answer, just as I imagine you do, whatever you believe about me, I just put my understanding of where the blind spots are likely to be differently than you do. And, and I think that's where to leave it. I think that is fundamentally our dividing line. You look at people in this debate and you say they're looking for examples of racism. They don't want to believe this other stuff. It's just science. And I look at that and I say it's not actually, the science is not showing that yet. And we have a society that is way far away from where it should be. And I don't know. I see this differently than you do.
I get that. But not in precisely the ways you think you do. I mean, I'm having the bewildering experience of agreeing with virtually everything you said there, and yet it has basically no relevance to what I view as our underlying disagreement. So
you have that bewildering experience because you don't realize when you keep saying that everybody else is thinking tribally, but you're not, that is our disagreement.
Well, no, because I know I'm not
that is
thinking tribally in this respect because I share your political biases there. Like I would line up with you completely. If I gave in to my bias, my social bias, I can't tell you what a relief it would be to recognize that Nisbet and Turkheimer are reasoning better than anyone else in this field. I can't tell you what a relief it would be to realize that Gould's book, The Mismeasure of Man, was right on the money.
Because the thing that you said when you brought on, and I feel like now we're just getting back to the beginning and we should let this go and I'll let you the last word after this. But right at the beginning of all this with Murray, you said, you look at Murray and you see what happens to you. You were completely straightforward about that you look at what happens to him and you see what happens to you. I think the relief.
It's not tribalism.
I think the relief
this is
you,
the experience of talking about ideas in public.
We all have a lot of different identities. We're part of it all times. I do too, right? I have all kinds of identities that you can call forward. All of them can bias me simultaneously. And the questions, of course, are which dominate and how am I able to counterbalance them through my process of information gathering and adjudication of that information. But I think that your core identity in this is as someone who feels you get treated unfairly by politically correct mobs, and
but that is not identity.
That
is my experience as a public intellectual trying to talk about ideas.
I will say this: that is what folks from the dominant group get to do. They get to say, "My thing isn't identity politics; only yours is." I will tell you, Sam, when people who do not look like you hear you telling them that this is just identity politics, they don't think, "God, he's right. That is just identity politics." They think this is my experience and you don't understand it. You just said it's your experience and they don't understand it.
You think that's Glenn Lowry's view of it or Ayaan Hirsi Ali's view of it or Majid Nawaz's view of it?
I think that you have said publicly that you will not have a conversation with Ta Nehisi Coates because you think he just plays identity politics. I think that you like people.
Yeah,
I think you like.
Yes. It's the same reason why I didn't want to have a conversation with you, honestly, because I think that it doesn't become fruitful. I mean, we're having, this is a post-mortem on our collision, and I think it was useful to do. And I can only hope our audience sorts it out for themselves in ways that will be accurate and useful.
I think that's a good place for us both to end.
Part of the reason that Sam Harris has always bothered me so much is that if you look at the pattern, this is going back several years when I always had a problem with, and now it's become a lot more stark, because when you get into race, quote unquote, science, this is a much, that hits most Americans a little bit more viscerally. But all of the anti-Muslim shit and all of the thought experiments about, dropping a nuclear weapon on the Muslim world and all of this nonsense, the same pattern of policy illiterate, aggressive, ahistorical approach and a reactionary bent, which when he is cornered, he retreats to usually either bizarre obsessive self-defense or just stating truisms. And I think this debate with Ezra Klein revealed a lot about Sam Harris. And we'll start, and this is also, it's inescapable because you can't not talk at this point about this guy's psycho-emotional issue. Let's just run through some of the sound clips from this exchange with Ezra Klein.
I think there is what you would call confusion here. I do think it's just important to say this. I have not criticized you, and I continue to not, for having the conversation. I've criticized you for having the conversation without dealing with and separating it out and thinking through the context and the weight of American history on it. Not the weight of American history.
The weight of American history is completely irrelevant to...
No, it can't possibly be irrelevant on something that even you admit is environmental.
The only thing that is relevant... So, yes, but that part of the conversation has been had. You don't have to talk about slavery. You don't have to talk about the specific injustices in the past to have a conversation about the environmental factors that very likely keep people back.
So, okay, here what's really interesting, and the reason that we wanted to isolate this is, first of all, that's actually the most honest distillation of Sam Harris's philosophy. And ironically, the guy is a total idealist and not an empiricist. He literally thinks, and you see this with religion, that abstractions and ideas exist almost in a Platonic form outside of history. During most of the conversation, he's on one hand saying that Charles Murray, who's an incredibly well-compensated and profoundly influential policy entrepreneur, who's written multiple best-selling books, who's won prizes, who's appeared in almost every major news outlet in the country, whose books are reviewed endless times in the New York Times. He's been on everything from ABC News to Bill Maher, that this guy is oppressed because some kids protested him, okay? While not doing that, he's then also basically saying, like, I don't agree necessarily with Murray's policy prescriptions, even though the whole point of Murray's work is his policy prescriptions. It's been quite influential. And if you look at the bell curve, he actually literally talks about the policy disincentives that need to be created from having, quote unquote, stupid mothers having children because of this genetic determinism. At the same time, while begging from Murray, he actually echoes Murray's core argument there, which is that even by the 1970s, when Charles Murray first came on the scene, he was saying that race and IQ could be completely disconnected from environment because Jim Crow and legal segregation was over, which in Murray's case fits with his far-right politics. And I would say, yes, indeed, racism. In Harris's case, Harris is so delusional and disconnected from any broader understanding of how the world works that, yes, in his personal normative sense, he's not a racist, but he becomes an active agent of racism through this attitude. What's the next clip we have?
You say that it is unfair journalistically to put your conversation within the lineage of the conversation going all the way back in American history, and all the way, as you say, pre-American history. In fact, in my piece, I quote Voltaire and Hume and others. That at each point, European-descended white men of scientific mind looked around them, looked at the society they saw, looked at the outcomes people had in the society they saw, looked at the science pulled from those outcomes, right? And it was called science back then too, and said, you know what? What we are seeing here is a result of innate differences between the races. But it's something I'm just going to say, we've not even talked through questions of like what it even means to talk about races and the way that has changed over time, but I'll just bracket that. And at each point, that has been, it's been justified in different ways with different kinds of science. But, now we look back and we say, oh man, they did not know what they were talking about. That was ridiculous. I mean, look at what was going on in their society. But they looked and they ran their studies and they ran the numbers and they said, there's just a difference here. There's a difference here. And that is why things are turning out the way they are.
But Ezra, I'm pointing out that the bias...
Tell me why it is unfair to put your conversation in that lineage. Why the burden of proof is not actually on you to say, here's why it is different this time. Here is why we are at a point, either in American history or science or whatever, where that is no longer, like, we are certain that nobody in 50 years is going to look back at us and say that. Because scientifically, what the scientists who are on my side of this argument think, and they include James Flynn and many others, they say that's where we are here. I just quoted him to you.
It was still a misleading summary of what he said. I know what he's on record saying here, and you're interpreting it in a way that you like. I understand that, but
no, I'm not interpreting. James Flynn just said to me 2 days ago that it is consistent with the evidence that there is a genetic advantage or disadvantage for African Americans. That it is entirely possible that the 10-point IQ difference we see reflects a 12-point environmental difference and a -2 genetic difference.
Sure. Many things are possible, right? We're trying to judge on what is plausible to say, and more important, I am worried about the social penalty for talking about these things, because again, it will come back to us on things that we don't expect, like the Neanderthal thing, right? Like that comes out of left field. Had it gone another way, all of a sudden we can't talk about Neanderthal DNA anymore, and it would be there's no point in having our politics be hostage to these kind of tripwire effects where you say something that seems politically invidious, merely talking about the data as they are. I mean, unless every population of human beings has exactly the same mean and the same variance for every trait we care about, we are guaranteed to be blindsided by these differences that seem important to people who care about differences among groups.
Okay, so first there's the possibility, and Sam hasn't commented on this, that I meditate as well. No one has shaken my faith in the power of meditation more than Sam Harris. But in my experience of meditating, I have not been able yet to connect psychically. If Sam psychically is connected with James Flynn, that he could read that what he said to Ezra Klein on the phone was wrong, he should immediately publicly release those emails. But beyond that, I mean, Jesus Christ, there's there's a real mess that Sam has created. It's pretty invidious for me to have to clean it up. But the first part that Ezra's making, if you didn't catch, is he's actually saying that what Flynn told him and what is possible is that this 10-point IQ gap might actually be a 12% environmental influence, which means that there's a 2% lead for black people in IQ over white people, which, speaking of innate biases, Sam Harris dismissed this hypothetical in a field that he admits does not have settled science on as basically just ridiculous. Should we hear that again? So let's just listen to that again. It is very revealing.
Still a misleading summary of what he said. I know what he's on record saying here, and you're interpreting it in a way that you like. I understand that, but
no, I'm not interpreting. James Flynn just said to me 2 days ago that it is consistent with the evidence that there is a genetic advantage or disadvantage for African Americans. That it is entirely possible that the 10-point IQ difference we see reflects a 12-point environmental difference and a -2 genetic difference.
Sure. Many things are possible, right? We're trying to judge on what is plausible to say, and
if we're stipulating that this is such sound science, and a lot of it is genetic, it actually seems to me that it might be possible that if you subjected one population to everything from slavery to mass murder to terrorism to systemic political, economic, job, and employment discrimination legally through at least the 60s, and then continued with social stigmas, cultural stories, which, by the way, Harris and Murray are doing their best to reinforce, to, again, housing, job, discrimination, police interactions, police violence, not to mention lead, other environmental pollutants, which have actually been shown empirically to lower IQ scores, including even down to telling kids to not eat fish because the mercury actually can lower their score as well. It actually strikes me that only a 10-point differential might be just the sort of like methodologically interesting question to ask. If the gap is that small, maybe we're talking about just a community that just starts with an innately higher intellectual advantage. I mean, this is, and by the way, that type of subjective musing and speculation about the data is social science. This isn't math. You're always framing data questions. You're always framing studies. Human bias and subjectivity is never impossible to escape, let alone when you're talking about research that exists in the context of the entirety of American history. And then Sam goes back to his real bailiwick, which is, of course, the real aggrieved parties, in a conversation that goes back to the founding crime of America is obviously him and Charles Murray. No one has been more hurt. Charles Murray burned a cross when he was a teenager. Part of his research comes from the Pioneer Foundation, which was a eugenicist group and involved research from people who literally did study things like penis size versus brain size, like actually, not as a joke. He used this research along with other pseudoscientific theories, and I will say pseudoscientific, to forward reactionary social policies, which not only have not marginalized him, they are our policies. We do have disastrously small spending on welfare and social advancement and social justice. And now we also have the type of immigration policies, which is paid attention to less, but he also called for in the bell curve along with Herrnstein. There's nothing in the science, if we even accept the science, that says that this is permanent and irreversible.
Yeah, if we grant the way that he conceives of race and IQ, it's bullshit still. And that's why he talks about Neanderthals, because the current data, Neanderthals in an alternate reality, where it turns out that it's not like Europeans that have some Neanderthal DNA, it's Africans. He suggests that in that hypothetical reality, we would have a PC outrage that maybe he'd have to self-immolate his career over. Yeah, but instead he's jumping the gun on that, like because he's fundamentally not. Because he's
a lunatic. And by the way, if that came out, no one would care. We wouldn't be sitting here in our studio like, oh my God, what are we going to do about the Neanderthal story that was created, that was written up in the back page of the science section of the New York Times, and maybe a handful of white supremacists ran with, and a handful of people on Twitter were offended by. No one gives a fuck. People do give a fuck about the attempt to naturalize racism so as to implement social Darwinism in policy, which the whole time he's saying he disagrees with. You know, at least Charles Murray is coherent in his despicable contributions to human life. That was
scientific
Ezra.
Data can't be racist.
The other fun thing about...
I got to remind myself that his cultists are so into people remaining calm at all times. Let me tap into my breathing. Scientific facts can't be racist. I mean... The deeper implication of this worldview is a war on every single human discipline besides a incredibly narrow quantitative idealism that never takes anything systemic or structural into account. And I have to say, like, even if you were cool with the dumbing down of the Islam stuff, which we'll get to in a second, and even if the race science stuff, for God's sake, doesn't bother you and disturb you and outrage you intellectually and morally, there's a reason why Silicon Valley robots are interested in this type of thinking. Like, this is the enabling of an algorithm-driven age with zero concern for any type of provision of public good and accounting for anything besides goals set within its own narrow limits. And really what's astonishing about Harris is, by all accounts, I mean, he is the one, he truly does not understand this. He is totally, I mean, he's sincere in all of his whiny bitchitude. He has no clue what he's doing.
He didn't blink when Ezra Klein brought up the point where Charles Murray, I can't remember in which book, is it Coming Apart, or
you mean
losing
human
ground.
accomplishment?
Where Murray measured human accomplishment by how many column inches black people versus white people got in the Encyclopedia Britannica.
Right. So you have right. Right. You literally have a guy who actually subconsciously, or for whatever reason, gave us all the great favor of being like, lest you were deceived with my intimidating seeming book, which was in fact a racist tract of discredited science analysis and social Darwinism. Here's this book, which is like the intellectual project of like a racist retired British gardener. Okay, that's like I'm on a pension, and what I'm going to do is look at the Encyclopedia Britannica and not too much space for the blacks, eh? I'm going to write that up and show that the humans whites accomplished the most. Charles Murray wrote that book, and this gormless motherfucker doesn't take anything from that. In fact, he thinks that he's one of the most oppressed people in America, which, as Ezra says, is a form of identity politics. At this point, if you want to be part of a decent, polite society, you really don't have any excuse to be defending this guy anymore. I mean, it's been the science at the very least is vastly more complicated. And the fact, by the way, that Harris talked, nobody else, by the way, Flynn does not talk in absolutes. And Turkheimer and Nisbet are clear about Murray and Harris's misreadings and dogmatism, but Harris isn't even from this field, which again, if we're taking that serious, that this is an indisputed field, Harris is not from it. He's read a couple of books and he's asserting that he's in the right. It's dogmatic, fundamentalist, and bizarre.
And what I found objectionable, I mean, in some ways, in particular, coming from Sam Harris, was the kind of casual way that it was presented, as though that conclusion, that groups of people have fixed lower IQs, is just sort of a natural conclusion that any sensible person would draw. And that, hey, look, things in the world are heritable. Height's heritable, IQ's heritable. We know that. Then you look at groups of people, there's differences in their IQ scores. Hey, they ought to be heritable too. Why wouldn't they? And, it's only if you're some kind of snowflake liberal who can't take the truth that you'd want to shrink from that obvious biological fact that people differ biologically, which obviously they do, and that those biological differences determine our behavior. And to me, that's taking, one of the most profound and loaded scientific controversies of our era and throwing it as a toss-off. It's like you don't even have to think about this. It's obviously true. And A, it's not obviously true. And B, I think it's especially wrong to speculate about things that harm people, that really, truly have the power to harm people in a lot of ways. If this were some, one of the studies I've done about people's performance on personality scales, and you have some interesting psychological theory about it, and somebody wants to speculate one way or the other, fine. Scientists do that. But we're speculating about the ability to function cognitively of whole groups of people, and that's just not something to do lightly. And I think all of that horror, that after we wrote this piece of, oh my God, how can they be criticizing this scientific work, is ridiculous. You don't speculate loosely about really negative things and then be shocked when people are sort of horrified to hear you do it.
That sort of blasé way that Harris waded into it was, first of all, obviously was incredibly arrogant. And that his assertion, and as someone totally outside of the field, that he represents a consensus and that you and your co-authors who are in the field, tenured professors in this world, are fringe. That was a real interesting PR tactic.
It's really, the simple answer is he doesn't know what he's talking about. Now, are there serious scientists out there who believe in the bell curve? Yes, there are, and I don't want to sell the opposite point of view.
Right.
The fact of the bell curve is that it's controversial, and there are serious scientists on both sides, on even more than both sides. I mean, there are people who are more anti-intelligence and more anti-heritability than I am.
Right.
There are people like me. There are people who think, well, I'm not willing to go to all the conclusions that the bell curve reached, but I think it's worth considering. And then there are people who think that the bell curve was mamby-pamby and you have to go much farther than that. And there are all sorts of points of view out there, and those things have to be argued on the merits, which is exactly what we on the scientific left have been accused of not wanting to do. Everybody's always saying, oh, liberals are afraid to talk about race and afraid to talk about genetics. And in the Vox article, we showed up and we talked about the science of race and genetics and said they were wrong about it. And there's this tone of, oh my God, how can you criticize us for doing this science?
Right.
And so, I don't want to take up more time than I have, but I think an important message for the left here, if I may,
please,
is that it's important to genetics and behavior and intelligence are topics that the right is way more interested in than the left. And I do think it's true that the left tends to shy away from those things. And I am on the left politically, and we need to be willing to think about those things because the scientific facts, in fact, don't compel any kind of right-wing agenda. I think the scientific facts are, at worst, neutral and at most support the kind of progressive values that I have. And so I think the intellectual left needs to engage with these things and needs to bring the fight to scientific right and the scientific far right, which is also out there. And there are a lot of us there, but a lot of people keep kind of quiet about it.
But again, it's often hard to find intelligent, fair criticisms from people who actually seem to be familiar with Sam's actual views. But I realize that this may be by design. There's an argumentative strategy known as the Gish Gallop, in which a person overwhelms you with a lot of information and arguments all at once. This kind of thing is really hard to respond to adequately because you have to break down every claim and every statement and provide an intelligent answer to each one. This, of course, requires a lot of preparation and effort, much more effort than the galloper himself has expended, to be sure. Because of this, users of the Gish Gallop often get away with weak arguments because their opponents are simply unable or unwilling to put forth the massive amount of energy it takes to debunk the onslaught of bullshit they've just been presented with. Sam Harris does this all the time. A close examination of much of Harris's writing reveals the fact that he makes a lot of vague, underdeveloped, or ambiguously worded claims without ever really elaborating on them before moving on to the next talking point. And when inevitably called out on these things, he becomes defensive, claiming that he's being misrepresented. And as I mentioned, he also usually accuses his opponents of deliberately strawmanning him because of some apparent conspiracy to ruin his reputation. But the problem is he fills these essays and articles with claims and arguments that I find it hard to believe he doesn't understand are provocative and controversial. Yet he responds with incredulous astonishment whenever people have a negative reaction. I can't believe you read my article titled "In Defense of Profiling" and are now accusing me of defending profiling. You must be intentionally trying to ruin my reputation. The aforementioned essay, "In Defense of Profiling," contains the sentence, "We should profile Muslims, or anyone who looks like he or she could conceivably be Muslim, and we should be honest about it." After noticing that people were understandably pissed off by this, he included an addendum where he wrote, "I am not narrowly focused on people with dark skin. In fact, I included myself in the description of the type of person I think should be profiled, twice. to say that ethnicity, gender, age, nationality, dress, traveling companions, behavior in the terminal, and other outward appearances offer no indication of a person's belief or terrorist potential is either quite crazy or totally dishonest. The 2 times that Harris includes himself as a potential candidate for profiling at the airport are here when he writes, "Although I don't think I look like a jihadi or like a man pretending not to be one, I do not mean to suggest that a person like me should be exempt from scrutiny." And later when he writes, "And again, I wouldn't put someone who looks like me entirely outside the bullseye. But there are people who do not stand a chance of being jihadists, and TSA screeners can know this at a glance." Notice how each of those statements come with sly disclaimers. I don't think I look like a jihadi. I'm not entirely outside the bullseye. Even from before where he says, I'm not narrowly focused on people with dark skin. He's just broadly focused on them, I guess. It seems very clear to me that he's not really talking about people who look like him. But my point is not to respond to this specific article, but to demonstrate the argumentative tactics Sam Harris likes to use. His claims are so vague and quick that he still has access to deniability. He can accuse you of misrepresenting him because he hasn't really represented anything of substance to begin with. He doesn't really define what he thinks a Muslim looks like, because that's impossible to do. There are billions of Muslims in the world. So he can safely deny any characterization you ascribe to him. All we can go off of is what it sounds like he's implying. And since the vast majority of Muslims are brown, in this case it really sounds like he's implying that it's okay if brown people are subjected to more scrutiny in airports, because in his estimation, Muslims are more likely to be terrorists. And that's a racially oppressive system, which will almost certainly have more drawbacks than benefits. I've heard similar arguments with regard to Black Americans. People say it's okay to profile Black people because Black people commit more crime than white people. Notwithstanding the fact that the level of racial bias is actually disproportionate to the amount of crime, this is still ridiculous. If you have a room with 100 people in it and one person does something bad, in my opinion, you are not now justified in profiling everyone in the room. And I honestly don't think Sam Harris is racist, but even if he is, I don't care. It's just another racist white dude. I mean, add it to the tally. But it does seem that he is much more concerned with self-absorbed indignation than he is with being thoughtful about how his ideas affect others and contribute to the spread of harmful oppression. In that same SPLC article I criticized earlier, they mentioned how actual white supremacists have literally cited Sam Harris as one of their stepping stones into the alt-right. And that's actually one of the things that I changed about myself over the years. I used to have this tireless insistence upon sticking to my principles and changing for no one. If you don't like me, fuck you. I know who I am, and I know what I mean, and I'm not responsible for other people's interpretations. And if you can't see my point of view, you're just too dumb or too sensitive to understand it. But the world doesn't work that way. Your words and actions have real effects on the people around you, especially if you have a large public platform. And you should give a shit about the impact of your words and how you make other people feel, even if you don't agree with their reasoning. Sam Harris would call this political correctness. I call it not being an asshole. But when you begin to read and listen to informed analyses of the Muslim world by experienced journalists and scholars, Sam's assessments seem very simplistic and lacking of nuance by comparison. The most obvious example is his insistence that the doctrine and traditions of Islam are the only or primary factors in radicalizing Muslims into violent extremists. I feel like even if you have a grade school understanding of world history and socio-political events, you can figure out that this sounds ridiculous. It's like saying crime in black neighborhoods is caused primarily by rap music. You can make an argument that it is a contributor, but it's obviously more complicated than that. But Harris is relentless in his refusal to acknowledge geopolitical factors that lead to radicalization of Muslims. And he only feels this way specifically about Islam and not extremists of other ideologies. In those cases, he's willing to acknowledge the nuance of complex political situations. Like I said, I don't think Sam Harris is racist or even anti-Muslim. If you take the time to really listen to the explanations of his arguments, it's difficult to honestly come to that conclusion, in my opinion. Unless you just don't believe him. He does seem to be very insensitive to how his ideas actually affect Muslims, but if he's so convinced that eliminating the unique evil of Islam is the only hope for the future of humanity, it's not hard to understand why. And he definitely seems to be convinced of that. So much so that he's willing to consider, whether hypothetically or not, normally unthinkable measures that would affect Muslims, such as racial profiling, torture, and nuclear first strikes. In my estimation, though, the reasoning through which he came to these conclusions almost completely ignores historical and political precedent, and seems to be based chiefly on his own subjective convictions. Which I guess is fine, but it makes it hard to take very seriously. He lambasted Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks for allowing people like Reza Aslan to come on his show and make false and inflammatory statements unchallenged. But I don't think he's ever extended this criticism toward his friend Dave Rubin, another person who has been associated with the intellectual dark web. And that's like all Dave Rubin's show is. My suspicion is that since Dave Rubin has been an important contributor to this anti-left narrative, Sam Harris gives him a pass. He was willing to invite Charles Murray, a scientist who was violently protested at Middlebury College last year, on his podcast to discuss whether black people are genetically predisposed to having lower IQ than white people, which is at the very least controversial among psychological researchers. But one could argue that this idea was implicitly endorsed during their conversation. I'm convinced that discussion was mainly had to bolster Harris's anti-left agenda. That is, to create a narrative where Charles Murray is some kind of victim of censorship by big bad politically correct progressives, even though all he's doing is a little science. But in typical Sam Harris fashion, that's an obvious oversimplification. Sure, some people have a knee-jerk reaction to any discussion of race and intelligence, even if they're completely ignorant of the relevant data. But just as many people are concerned with presentation of debatable ideas as if they're settled science, especially ideas that can be easily latched onto and utilized by racists and those who wish for the downfall of already disadvantaged groups. So yeah, a lot of progressives have a very negative view of Sam Harris. I think this is in large part due to his unwillingness or inability to express himself in a concise way, making it very easy for people to interpret his ideas as bigoted or maniacal. I think that when you take the time to carefully process the things he said over the years, it becomes obvious that he's not some crazy racist. But you shouldn't have to analyze multiple podcasts and dozens of hours of videos in order to decide whether or not someone is a bigot. Maybe it's you, Sam. But even if he isn't a racist, the vague and loose way he considers things like Islam and race science do more harm than good to the discourse surrounding them by providing pseudo-intellectual ammo to the weapons of actual racists.
He also said that Vox is basically as bad as the KKK.
Oh, right. He said that they were the moral equivalent of the KKK. Yeah, that was good. That was I mean, that is actually, I've been a long time Sam Harris critic and have been sort of just shocked at how many people are taken in by the mediocrity. But has he always been this crazy? That line is even that's a standout. That's an insane comment. Let's play it.
So it's just interacting with a reporter from, Salon or Vox, right? Who's there? I'm meeting someone who essentially has the intellectual and moral integrity of the guy in the white hood, over on the right. And
so he's gonzo. I don't if you're still a fan for him and you don't realize that he's even if you can't even understand the race stuff and you can't understand the foreign policy stuff and you can't understand the overrated stuff, if you don't get that comparing Ezra Klein to a guy in a hood is a self-canceling, awe-inspiringly insane thing to say, then you're also insane and nuts.
And really what they need to hear is there's another daddy for you to go to. Hitchens got Charles Murray right. So just go back to Hitchens, guys.
Look, that would be the best thing that could come out of this. Hitchens had his problem, but look, he was totally wrong on really important things, but he was also right on a great many things. He was always a great wit and a great writer. He understood Charles Murray was a racist. He knew a thing about history.
Yeah, wasn't threatened by learning about history.
He wasn't threatened by learning about history. He traveled the world. He was actually funny. He had something else to say. You know, yes, if Hitch was there, then it would be like, fuck. That's a lot of firepower on the other side.
I think Harris would know his lane a lot better, too.
Yeah, Harris, that's probably true. Harris would be like, my next book on meditation good, Islam bad. And also regurgitating ideas from the Oxford Encyclopedia of Philosophy so that mommy will affirm that I have a great intellect and I'll justify having a Golden Girls Trust Fund. And yes, that is an ad hominem. That's true. It's demonstrable.
You should know
all
where people
available
got their
evidence.
seed money from.
What?
You should know where people got their seed money from.
Yes. Particularly if you if you had the privilege to bum around until your 30s and then basically just get subsidized to create a persona of public intellect, which hit all of the grids. The perfect posture when Sam Harris first came on the scene. Could you imagine? On one hand, I'm going to validate every single mainstream, educated, centrist fear and terror about the Middle East, bigotry towards Muslims and Palestinians, and I'm going to validate the foreign policy consensus of the time. And then, oh my God, don't even get me into, I get it, that he technically opposed the invasion of Iraq. Maybe. I'm not even going to go down that rabbit hole. Okay, so don't even come at me with this. That is all I will say is his position on Iraq is subject to a lot of interpretation. And that is not the fault of those who have been reading and listening to him. But then also at the same time, call out Bush for, and Christian fanaticism. I mean, that was a perfect market opportunity. Because I would invite you to entertain the possibility that if Sam Harris's analysis of politics in the ideal 2020 candidate is so both empirically disconnected from reality and such a obvious projection, in fact, of pure identity politics would actually be the only way to describe this. And so profoundly disconnected from, I'm not talking moral, I'm talking just a strategic assessment of where the Democratic Party is and also what would be required to win back the types of voters that he alludes to in this segment. Entertain the possibility that if he knows this little about politics, maybe he's overselling himself a little bit on other areas that he speaks with such sort of projected grand authority on. Here's Sam Harris a couple days ago on Joe Rogan talking about the ideal 2020 presidential candidate.
It's we have to find someone who can stand outside the circular firing squad, right? And it would be someone who's, it would be, in my view, it would be somebody like a younger Bloomberg, right? I mean, I don't think it's Bloomberg, but somebody like a legit businessman who could call bullshit on all of Trump's fake business acumen and
pause it.
Who's not.
Sorry, I have to do a pause it. Sam Harris may not recall, because Sam Harris is highly not history oriented, which is actually a major part of the profound distortions and problems and, as he would call, mess of his work. But in very recent history, and to be fair to Sam, I know his people are extremely anxious about being fair to him. Mike Bloomberg wasn't the presidential candidate, but in 2016, Michael Bloomberg was given a primetime speaking slot at the DNC to make precisely this argument, that he made actual money himself and Trump was full of shit. So this has already been highly publicly aired material. In fact, that was the centerpiece of every public intervention that Michael Bloomberg had as one of the most prominent Hillary Clinton surrogates in the country. Anyways, go ahead.
Who's not ethically compromised, right? But who can get stuff done, and so
right,
and definitely not someone who feels the need to pander to the far left on these identity politics issues.
Oh,
I think identity politics is really going to be bad for us against Trump, because so much of the country, I mean, the crucial sliver of the country, I mean, you just have to ask yourself, who was it who voted for Obama and then, or twice, and then voted for Trump, right? Those people aren't racist. Those people are sick of being called racist. So what's happening on the left around identity politics and all of these, I mean, it's not that race problem, it's not that transgender issues don't have to be worked out. I mean, all of those are legit concerns, but the fact that that's the center of mass politically on the left in a nationwide election against someone like Trump, I just think that's an absolute recipe for disaster.
Okay, so do you see the fusion of concern trolling, disingenuousness, empirical falsehood, and then actually ways of, and this is very actually evocative of his Muslim method, which is just speaking out of his mouth, both sides of his mouth, which is like, hey, I don't want to hear about the transgender and race stuff all the time. Now, those are legitimate concerns, but I mean, people are tired of hearing about it. They're legitimate concerns, right? But then it's like, okay, first of all, the empirical evidence on Trump to Obama to Trump voters are actually very complicated, and they're multivariable. And the research, I think, from Sands actually indicates that because the electorate has been re-racialized in a certain way by Trump, that people who in 2020 held 2012 held highly bigoted attitudes, but weren't given a method through which to express that, are now doing that because that message is being tailored to them. Then, you know what? I agree with Sam Harris. I think that there are a segment of voters in geographically vital states who were bought in by Donald Trump's economic scam and sick of the Democratic Party portraying them on economic issues. I still think that stands, and it stands certainly at the most geographically important point. Now, obviously, those people are not just people that flipped to Trump, white people that flipped to Trump. There's also the many African-American voters that just didn't vote. And of course, Sam Harris isn't reading Malika Jabali or reading any polls and doesn't know any of it. But what candidate do you think would be most primed to speak to and get those voters back who are worried about healthcare, deindustrialization, and oligarchs ripping them off? Oh, well, of course, a technocratic billionaire who says we can't afford Medicare for all and regularly undermines and speaks out against the most popular social programs in the country. This is just the part. And again, guys, you can look this up. There is no polling that indicates that there is a broad constituency for this. If you look at politics in a grid, there's people on the right in the Republican Party who are far right on social issues and economic issues. There's people in the Democratic Party who are left on economics and social. And there's some people in the actual middle who I would say are actually not necessarily socially conservative, but they are socially moderate, socially centrist, however you're defining that. And they're with us on the banks and on Medicare for all and those issues. And then there's this little tiny cluster that probably literally includes the green room of Morning Joe and Sam Harris, of people who are like, I don't hate gay people. I'm pretty terrified of black people. And I don't mind a mart slightly paying a little bit more taxes because I'm incredibly wealthy, but I don't want a big social safety net. That is the American elite. There is no electoral base for it. The only time maybe there was in the mid-90s at the peak of the tech bubble. And Bill Clinton also ran to the right on social issues. Now, again, I know this is, I'm sorry that I'm not speaking in thought experiments, but this is like actual political reality that he's wading into. Add to it, there are plenty of people who are speaking out about the rights of transgender people and race, because those are fundamental justice and equity issues of our time. Nobody, even the most woke candidate, and all the Democratic candidates that are viable are actually, at least rhetorically, on the same page on these rights issues. Nobody has a single Democratic candidate who's announced yet. Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, I'm forgetting people, Julian Castro. Did anybody, I hope, and I'm not sure, but I hope they all mentioned some type of serious equity agenda across the board in their campaign speeches. Are any of them building a campaign around a Twitter hashtag on wokeness? Is that happening for any candidate. Anyone. No. What he's actually alluding to is that the Obama administration in the last couple of years changed the federal rule on transgender people rights, and there was some backlash to that. Although, again, empirically, if you actually break down the numbers, it did not cost the Democrats any votes. The people that voted against it and were most freaked out about it were not in the pocket of voters anyways. There was no segment that you could actually measure of people that were like, oh yeah, I was totally going to vote for Democrats, but because I'm so freaked out by sharing a bathroom with somebody or whatever the fuck else is going on in your head to actually motivate you to vote in such a ludicrous fear-based way that I flip my vote. It's not empirically valid. It's not empirically sound.
And it's also just fucking wrong. Like, the thing about Sam Harris is, like, he's talking this old trope that's been in American politics for decades. It's like, oh, what we need is a neutral businessman to come in and they'll win president because people can agree on the center. Nobody fucking wants that. Even politicians, like, you know, we could talk about Obama and, like, his legacy being sort of centrist. Obama wasn't running and presenting himself as, like, a centrist guy. Obama had a very, like, a bold campaign that really inspired people and had a lot of energy behind it. Right. Americans don't want to vote for, and same thing with Donald Trump. Not in a good way, but Donald Trump was, you know, very loud and there was energy because he was saying, you know, crazy right-wing stuff, right? But he was going out there and was really passionate about a certain thing.
That's what Sam Harris wants, because Sam Harris is projecting
They want
his
this kind of monotone politician.
Because that's who he is.
Yeah.
It's the most raw form. Look, it's one thing to have a conversation about identity politics, about groups, particularly groups that are presently and historically repressed. I think we can all agree that literal identity politics, as in I as a singular soul individual would like my personal biases represented in a candidate, I think we all could hold a check on. So I understand why Sam Harris specifically wants a young Mike in his, of course, it being Sam Harris, we're still not even talking about a thing that actually exists. But I understand why he would want something like that. But it doesn't represent anything other than a small of other cluster of people who are already way over influential. And let me just add one other thing. He's alluding to there, and he actually, you know, he's talking about the left eating its own in another part of the clip. And again, I think, you know, coming to the right place in the wrong way about some of the aspects of this culture that I certainly don't like. But I think a big part of the problem with like that culture he's talking about is hyper-literalism and a complete reduction of human beings to a one-dimensional variable, which is how Sam Harris got his start.
Exactly.
And this is why, by the way, you need to do, and I'll be intentionally provocative, you need to have a bad faith reading of Sam Harris. Because there are absolutely people, and I do see it inside the left. I agree with Ben Burgess. I think it's a problem inside the left. People have migrated tactics that do work for Ben Shapiro to arguments inside the left where there are valid positions, and you need to figure out arguments, and things like reading people charitably is a valid term. But when your whole public persona is based on playing word games and speaking out of both sides of your mouth as an umbrella to forward toxic stances towards Muslims, transgender people, African Americans, all just because you're just in the complete uninterrupted bubble of your own identity and unchallenged ideological perceptions because you have no empathy or historical curiosity, I can't read that empathetically. Or charitably, because there's the context behind that is you're somebody who's constantly going after these communities. That's what your context is. You didn't. If he had a different trajectory, I would disagree, but I would note there's a different origin here for that point. The origin here for that point is he's been doing that shit his whole career.
Yeah, and that's what you said about how there's this contingent of people online who are so concerned with being fair to Sam Harris, whereas Sam Harris has purposely chosen these topics. If he wants to speak truth about this shit, he should be ready for the blowback that comes and
100%.
Take it. Like this
100%.
this is comes with the territory, buddy.
And by the way, own your position. I actually think, you know, in some ways he draws more heat than people who, you know, people say, well, why not this person and that person and da-da-da. And it's like, well, first of all, because he takes the simple-minded and literalists down this path more so than other people.
Well, it's like,
and then secondly, it's like, frankly, and I should say, and also, to be fair, some people who are more intelligent and more sophisticated. But then there's also like, you know, people who are just making an assertion that we might profoundly disagree with and fight against, but we don't have to do all of this legwork to fight through the disingenuousness of what their position actually is. Like, what if we played word games all day to say, like, because like, clearly we support Medicare for all, but what if we played word games to create the plausible deniability of support for said position? Would that annoy you? So, and we'll all tee off in this in a second, but you know, right now we have a president who is sending racist, you know, and again, at their core, I think even Sam Harris, it would probably be somehow able to puncture his shockingly limited perception that telling 4 United States citizens to go back to where they came from because of political disagreement has at least some degree of xenophobia and is sending the wrong signals. Let me use Sam. Let me use Sam type language when he's not talking about Islam or the left, when he has nothing but hyperbole and melodrama. Let me use more gentle language for this. So that's happening. There is a piece in the Wall Street Journal. It's a classic dishonest smearing op-ed about Ilhan Omar by a far-right Zionist, with all the stuff that we know. And I say that, by the way, very specifically. I in my politics are not Zionist because I'm not a nationalist, and I like the idea of a full equal democracy for all human beings in the Middle East and full cultural autonomy and protection. But there are liberal Zionists. There are absolutely Zionists that don't lie about Ilhan Omar. Peter Beinart, as far as I understand, still supports a 2-state 67 border solution and has been quite clear that lying and distorting Ilhan Omar's position is dishonest and bigoted. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, whose personal trauma we can understand and sympathize with, but whose infantile reactionary politics we should reject every single time she pops up, retweets this trash article about Ilhan Omar on the day that she is getting threatened by the President of the United States. And Sam Harris, in a beautifully cowardly move, does the retweet, revealing his priorities, which is, of course, not what the president is doing, but an example to spread utter calumny about an endangered congressperson. And then, look, and this is my perception, but my interpretation of doing this is that Sam Harris engages consistently in the most stupid and vulgar identity politics. One identity politics of the identity politics that he has no understanding of, which is that he has his own very, very strong identity politics, which shapes his paranoia, delusions, and horrific worldview. But also the fact that one of his standalone responses to anything and his complete inability to think historically and critically is, Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a friend. I know Ayaan Hirsi Ali, you're smearing me. So, in classic Harris manner, he's going to retweet her and launder her grotesque smears of Ilhan Omar while not focusing on the prime actual action of this country right now.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali owes her career to identity politics and standpoint epistemology.
Pure standpoint epistemology and identity politics. And I reject that position. Look, the distinction, obviously, your life experience, your identity informs your politics and your understanding. Anybody who would say that that isn't true or that's somehow illegitimate is either delusional, dishonest, or stupid. Conversely, if the end point of your argument for whatever it is, good or, in a global sense, it's one thing to talk about in the context of certain issues of your own community, absolutely. But if your only singular fallback for everything is my identity dictates I understand this global statement better than you, no, I reject that. Sorry. Well, that is literally her response to everything. That's why Ayaan Hirsi Ali can go to Israel and have nothing to say about the occupation or racism there, but notice that women wear bikinis, so it must be an enlightened society.
It's a good grift.
It's embarrassing. Look, it might be sincere, but it's, yes. And I just want to always, David, I want you to say this in a second, but just give me 10 seconds to always say Ina from Nice Mango. What is the name of her show?
Yeah, Nice Mangoes.
Nice Mangoes. Ina, right?
Ina Muhammad, yep.
Ina Muhammad, who does I actually really strongly disagree with her in some areas. Ironically, including on some of this sort of stuff. But she does a great, incredibly thoughtful show. And also, again, speaking from the perspective of a woman of Muslim background, she had an opportunity to get in on that game and didn't take it because of her total intellectual and moral integrity. And those motherfuckers reject her now. Believe me. When you have and she still is quite consistent and steady in her critiques of Islam and Islamic theocracy. And she should get everybody's, support and solidarity because she does a good show. And also she has a lot of intellectual courage, in my opinion.
Okay, back to Sam denying the seriousness of white supremacy. When he's not tweeting links to things confirming his narrative about this being the least racist time in America, he's recording the types of episodes I'll be discussing here. And it boggles my mind. Why would he do this to himself? Over and over and over again. Make himself look so ludicrous, so tone deaf, trying to deny something that is so obviously a massive issue right now, increasing in urgency by the day. He looks no better than the religious apologist defending terrible scripture that he's mocked for years, really. You see, when he himself is part of the group that's been shown with empirical evidence now to be a gateway to radicalizing people to the alt-right, he has a vested interest in downplaying or denying the seriousness of white supremacy.
One thing that people seem to have taken issue with and widely misunderstood.
Sam Harris being misunderstood? What?
Was my claim that Trump's "go back to your own countries" tweets were not clear signs of his racism.
Go back to your own country is like the most classic racist thing you can say.
No, I've long said that I have no doubt that Trump is racist.
But Sam's gonna split hairs here and say, yeah, Trump is racist, but was this one classically racist thing that he said, was that really a clear sign of Trump's racism? No, not to Sam.
But I've often said that we have to be precise in making these allegations, right?
You see, this is about precision. Sam just cares about being precise. Blah, blah, blah. Obligatory problem with the left.
My problem with the left is that it's finding evidence of racism everywhere, even where it manifestly does not exist.
Yeah, this is such a great example, Sam. Like Trump telling 4 women of color to go back to where they came from.
And here was a case in Trump's recent tweets against the so-called squad where it was susceptible to other readings, right?
What the fuck? I'm amazed. It's susceptible to other readings.
And I thought it was counterproductive to seize upon these tweets as clear signs of his racism and indeed his white supremacy.
This part coming up is just so typical Sam Harris.
Again, I'm giving Trump the benefit of the doubt here.
Of course.
Which I think I should always do.
Of
because
course.
I despise the man.
Mm-hmm.
People often accuse me of claiming that I have no biases. That's simply untrue. I have biases.
Yeah, Sam, we know. All your biases are with the left, of course. And you just somehow managed to rise above them. That's what a great man you are.
I try to correct for them. Mm-hmm. Here's my bias. I find Trump to be one of the most repellent human beings I can think of. That is a significant bias. I should be bending over backwards to give him the benefit of the doubt when there is a doubt. And the left should do likewise. Especially if they don't want 4 more years of Trump in office.
You got that, lefties? You gotta be bending over backwards to give Trump the benefit of the doubt, or else you'll be responsible for making him win again. Not the people that vote for him, not the people that support him, not the rampant racism and white supremacy. It's you, not bending over backwards, to give Trump the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, this is what Trump tweeted. So interesting to see, quote, progressive Democrat congresswomen who originally came from countries whose governments are a complete and total catastrophe, the worst, most corrupt, and inept anywhere in the world, if they even have functioning government at all, now loudly and viciously telling the people of the United States, the greatest and most powerful nation on earth, how our government is to be run.
But this already is viewing them as outsiders. How does he not see this? They're as American as anyone else, and that is the racism, viewing them as the other. It doesn't get more typically racist than that. If that is not a clear sign to Sam, then nothing short of a KKK hood would be a clear sign.
Why don't they go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came? Then come back and show us how. Okay, well, the president is clearly expressing contempt for these 4 congresswomen and contempt for the countries he imagines they came from. Now, his error here, his main error, is that only one of them is an immigrant, Ilhan Omar, from Somalia. And Somalia is precisely one of those countries that fits Trump's description here. But the fact that Trump was wrong about the other 3 congresswomen, they're all natural-born U.S. citizens, that is being interpreted as a symptom of his racism. Right? Go back to your own countries, when in fact this is their country. I ascribe this to Trump's ignorance. He couldn't be
This is Ilhan Omar's country too, even though she's an immigrant, Sam.
bothered to figure out who these people were. He might not be able to name all 4 of them. I bet he knows Ilhan Omar. He knows AOC. Does he know Rashida Tlaib and Ayanna Pressley?
He commented on her not being allowed into Israel. Yes, he knows who she is.
I wouldn't bet on it. It is easy to imagine that he just assumed they were all immigrants, or was just speaking about Ilhan Omar.
And that still would be racism, Sam.
Once again, this falls into the evil Chauncey Gardner framing. He is not playing 4-dimensional chess. He's not a genius. He is a buffoon.
Which is Sam's main issue with Trump. Time and time again, he frames his criticisms of Trump in terms of Trump's buffoonery and unpredictability. Either he's a balloon that's the air is coming out of, or he's a rhinoceros, or something like that. It's never like being appalled at his racism. There's never any sense of urgency about that. Even if he mentions it in passing, it isn't real shock and disgust.
Sure, he's also a racist.
You see, that's secondary. Sure, he's also a racist.
But again, this isn't clear evidence, in my view, of racism. Had these women come from Ireland, right, at the height of the potato famine,
This is gold.
Trump could easily have said, go back to your own starving country and fix that before telling us how to run the greatest nation on earth. And there would have been no implication of racism.
Really? Did he really just say that? I mean, it amazes me how ignorant he is. He's got a toddler's understanding of racism. It is so literalist and so basic. And maybe that's on purpose because he doesn't want to have a more nuanced and deeper understanding of racism, because that would include more things. There's a long history of racist fear-mongering against the Irish. There were no Irish need apply signs. There was fear-mongering about them interbreeding with white women. There was like religious bigotry against them mixed with the racial bigotry. There were illustrations that depicted them as apes and gorillas. Like, there's a long tradition of dehumanizing and not considering the Irish white. And these are times when maybe Sam would benefit from trying to understand lefty concepts a bit more. You know, the shifting concept of whiteness. Jews, Italians, and the Irish, they all kind of shifted from being considered the other into being considered white. And I just cannot believe that he used the Irish as an example of it not being racist. There are articles upon articles and books about, you know, the Irish not being considered white. I mean, why can't he use Google even? And if you've been playing Sam Harris bingo right now, get your cards out because you're about to check one off.
Problem is, the left is as fixated on race as the far right is.
Of course. the obligatory equivalence. The left is fighting racism and the far right is doing racism. So, of course, they're both, equally fixated on race. Have you ever come across such superficial bullshit? I don't know what to say without repeating myself over and over again, but this is shockingly bad. Even for Sam, it's shockingly bad. And that thing that he does about, I have biases that are with the left. He did that in his interview with Ezra Klein, too, when they were talking about Charles Murray and him maybe being biased towards that. He was all like, no. My biases are with the left. It's just me correcting for my biases that I have to have these conversations. I mean, what a noble guy, right? He's just trying to go against his extremely SJW, extremely left-leaning biases. And that's why he says and does all these things.
That's the basis for my demurral about Trump's tweets. He's an ignoramus and a blowhard and a bully.
And again, these are issues that Sam has that are more important than Trump's racism.
Donald Trump, and he did not say this after the terrorist atrocity at the Christchurch shooting. He did not say this, Donald Trump. But he acknowledged that the El Paso shooter, part of his manifesto was one of white supremacy and racism. It was also one of eco-scarcity as well. So there's a lot of dynamics there. So, but we know that there is a global ideology right now that is of white nationalism, white supremacy, and we also know more broadly there's a resurgent nationalism, some of which likes to disaggregate itself from overt racism. There's a really prominent Israeli intellectual whose name is escaping me at the moment, but he's sort of the architect of this. As a sort of cerebral movement. He's very tight with Netanyahu. It is spanning the globe. Hungary, United States, Poland, Brazil, and then different variants, but in a synchronized fashion. Turkey, Philippines, India, Russia, obviously Israel. We see this. Specifically when it comes to white supremacy rhetoric, we know that the rhetoric of replacement, the horror of birth rates, the obsession with refugees. This is a through line that connects and parallels the El Paso terrorist manifesto and the Christchurch terrorist manifesto. Now, Sam Harris, but it seems to me, and my interpretation of what he appears to be saying here, is that one, he's getting a lot less careful, and two, that this is truly extraordinary because Sam's just horrifically childish ahistorical writing about Islam, that it was basically to understand this massive complex phenomenon from terrorism to the nature of the religion itself to over 1 billion people that span from Senegal to Kansas. You just needed to read a couple of hadith and Quran quotes in English translation. You didn't need to know any history. You didn't need to know anything about international affairs. You didn't need to know about different competing philosophical and religious forces in Islam. I mean, again, people don't like to hear this, and they like to say that it's being politically correct, but literally, this is embarrassing. I mean, it is embarrassing to reduce things to that level. And the response from people that defended Sam was like, oh, well, you just don't want to confront that there is a toxic ideology here that's animating a group like Al-Qaeda. And of course, it was like, yes, absolutely, there's a toxic ideology here that's animating a group like Al-Qaeda. And we have to look at why. One element could be that the Quran is easy to use, by these people, right? That maybe we could confront things in terms of some of the aspects of the text. That would certainly be true of the Bible or the Torah. It's definitely true of some Hindu literature. These things can be used and distorted in certain ways. The primary thing, if we're serious, we'd have to look at Saudi and U.S. foreign policy, not in terms of just doing wrong to people, but just in terms of literally materially what ideology was funded, as an example, through the Mujahideen. Why did the Pakistanis and the Saudis always pick the most extreme Mujahideen fighters, as an example? Obviously, none of these things they were interested in dealing with. But the point was that Sam's whole shtick was, it's just you have beliefs and then you have actions, and that's all that matters. Now he's still not going to go to broader historical political conditions because he doesn't think like that. But in a case where you have a literal manifesto from a literal terrorist, except this terrorist is talking about white supremacy. And in fact, if you're Sam and you want to take all the FBI statistics and everything else seriously, we all know that that white supremacist terrorism is an infinitely bigger threat to all of us. Listen to what Sam Harris has to say about this.
There are people, it seems, who fall into one of these two categories, who are living in an online culture of trolling now, where killing people and writing semi-bogus or entirely bogus manifestos merely designed to confuse the media is becoming a new phenomenon, right? These are people who are not moved by a sincere ideology. They're just, quote, shitposting. The behavior of trolling on websites like 4chan and 8chan has been exported to the real world in the form of mass murder designed as a troll. And to some degree, I believe the Christchurch shooting in the mosque had this form, right? It's still not entirely clear what happened there. So this is
out there.
Yeah, I mean, look, you can read his manifesto. And again, it's so funny to me because I'll just do, Sam Harris Islam talk right now, which is, it's a manifesto, it exists, you can read it. He stated his own beliefs. These things are all readily available for anybody to read if they want to read.
And it goes beyond the manifesto. The Christchurch killer was in email contact with Martin Sellner of the Identity Movement.
Right. This is a very important part.
Right.
I'll read briefly from this. An Austrian far-right leader with ties to American fascists sent a coffee invitation to a man now accused of murdering 50 million Muslims in Christchurch in New Zealand. Martin Sellner, the leader of the Austrian identitarian movement, received approximately $1,700 donation from Bret and Torrent in early 2018. Sellner and his movement push racist conspiracy theories, including one that Torrent used as the title of his manifesto as he allegedly murdered 50 worshippers in March. After the financial ties were revealed, Sellner tried to distance himself from Torrent. But Austrian and German outlets reported this week that Sellner had exchanged emails with Torrent until at least July 2018, and that both men invited each other to their respective countries. And Sam Harris has plenty of lines that you can look up that people like Mehdi Hussein and Murtaza Hussein have documented that say, in his laborious, thought experiment way, convey very similar sentiment to Sellner and Southern. Like that's just reality. And in fact, he himself said at one point several years ago that it will be only the fascists who speak honestly if we don't get real about Islam. I'm paraphrasing. Once again, I know out of context. But this is just extraordinary because what you have here, and look, liberals who are running around saying that now we need to treat this like terrorism, Pete Buttigieg has a horrifying dystopian. Let's import, which by the way, it already was being used on Muslim populations to a significant extent. The tactics of terrorism and counterinsurgency that we've used abroad that have killed so many innocent people, that have caused so many problems. No, of course that's not the answer. Of course, again, we need to look at the material conditions in a broad sense. What is the role of social alienation? What is the role of isolation? What is the role of unaddressed histories of racism and bigotry and white supremacy and male supremacy? What is the role of technology and how that loops back with a lack of real bonds? How does this relate to the changing economy? And even if they're relatively more better off, still diminished opportunities. All of these things need to be addressed. As Bill Fletcher Jr. said, right-wing populism is the herpes of capitalism. Sam Harris, I'm sure he's got some spiel about social media companies, but I don't hear anything structural in that. And this is, of course, exactly the analysis he had no time for, did his best to demonize when it was about over 1 billion people and the most important foreign policy questions of our time. Then on the other hand, though,
maybe they were just shit posting.
Yeah, maybe look. Well, no, precisely though, because again, if you read the research of an actual person who does actual work on these things, like Scott Atran, he actually did document, in this case, not the posting, but actually things like social bonds and lack of purpose, and why is it that there's a correlation with like petty crime and going into terrorism. And this is all like, this is ridiculous because I read a translation of the Hadith and you can see it documented in ISIS's own documents. Sam Harris is actually saying with a straight face, he's not doing his previous game, which is, oh, you forget that Jeff Sessions is attorney general and Donald Trump is president. White supremacy is a weird fringe thing in society. Saying exactly what Tucker Carlson says without any of Tucker Carlson's interesting content, I might add, or any of his understanding of class. And then, what he's doing in this one is, after a career of saying you don't need to really do any serious analysis of anything involving the most pressing racial foreign policy issues of our time. Oh, well, in this case, you can just ignore the manifesto. That's just 4chan.
That's just stuff written down. People relate to text in all sorts of complex ways.
I had no idea that Sam Harris was such a postmodernist. Now, again, I'll say again, this is what it appears to be from this clip. And I did notice in that clip, it seemed like he was actually, finally, somewhat to his credit, he did seem to be speaking a lot more clearly and not sort of giving so many, booby traps and outs and thought experiments and other nonsense to evade making his point, as he always did with Islam. But if that is what he's putting across, wow. I mean, that's just unreal. Is there anything else?
We got a little bit more, and then I want to bring Christian Picciolini into here.
Okay.
Had this form, right? Still not entirely clear what happened there. So this is a kind of derangement that social media has introduced into our lives, where some people are willing to commit murder and even mass murder simply to enjoy the spectacle it creates online. Again, they're either crazy or evil or both, but in certain cases, the reasons for their behavior are not as they appear, right? And the media seems to get very confused about it.
Whoa, what? Are you serious? There has to be... No, you know what? I'm sorry. Even I have to believe that this is a truncated quote. And Sam Harris said, here is a parody of what I would say if I was in the most bald way contradicting everything I've ever said past the point of human credulity and comprehension. There's no way. That has to be taken out of context. Sam, I apologize in advance. There's no way. There is no way, after you reducing thousands of years of human history and cultural development to a couple of passages in a holy book whose original language you don't even read or comprehend, and no foreign policy understanding, that you say you can understand all of that, and that bad beliefs lead to bad actions, etc., etc. And in this case, with a known manifesto that you can read, by the way, in the same language that was written within weeks, that echoes all of the rhetoric of global nationalist politics right now, that we just can't say what's going on in front of our own eyes. There's no way. You have to be joking. It's got to be a joke. And in fact, I had no idea Sam Harris was funny.
What's also rich about this is he's sort of boulderizing a Christian Picciolini take that I think actually probably is true, and I think this is where the grain of truth maybe Sam Harris defenders might want to come at us with. Here's what Picciolini said. Have also noticed a phenomenon I call cult hopping in young extremists. They hop from extreme to another, far left to far right or vice versa, also Nazi to ISIS. Right. It's a broken search for identity, community, and purpose. This is less about ideology than most people think, and I think that's definitely true.
100% true, and this is exactly what Sam Harris said was nonsense when Scott Atran, who actually does ethnographic research and has actually, talked to ISIS members, spent time in this region, he said it was all of the things that Christian Picciolini says, who, by the way, incidentally, Christian Picciolini is a ex-Nazi who exits people from these groups. Maybe he would know,
who had a falling out with Sam Harris.
Who had a falling out with Sam Harris because Sam Harris needed to defend the honor of Stefan Molyneux, apparently.
I can't remember.
I don't remember what it was. They had a falling out. What a surprise. That's incredible. So if you come at us with the grain of truth of what Sam's saying here,
which by the way, I just want to hasten to add, Picciolini was not saying that about Christchurch.
He was absolutely not saying that about Christchurch. But I do want to just say more broadly, if you want to say the grain of search that Sam Harris is identifying contradicts every single thing that he has ever said about terrorism in Islam. So great. Take that line of inquiry, read Scott Atran, read Steve Cole, get a proper understanding of these things. Because at this point, as we deal with ascendant white nationalist terrorism in governments, we really needed to not have the same failures to begin with when it came to the Middle East and South Asia, but in a very self-interested way. If you live in the United States, you cannot apply the same horrific national security state policies and rank stupidity of analysis that people like Sam Harris brought forward. But that really is, I mean, I really remain, I want to keep putting on the record that 20% of me, for the fact that I have zero respect for Sam Harris, that has to be taken out of context. There's no way that he's saying that literally.
Spelling that out sounds somewhat invidious, and we don't really have time to clean up the mess.
Is he describing his whole career? Amazing.
My entire career is under threat now because thought occurred to me that what if Muslims are shitposting too?
Could you imagine if after there was an ISIS beheading, somebody was just like, you have someone like Jihadi John who's directionless and disturbed and has some bad experiences with the British national security state, and he's kind of shit posting a little bit. He's looking for direction and purpose. And then, there's this political vacuum that gets opened up. Sam Harris would be the first to call you a morally relative at every term in the book. And it's just what's so incredible is that there's nothing wrong with a little bit of clarity about ISIS or the Christchurch shooting. You just have to say, okay, how do we actually deal with it? Which, of course, Sam had nothing for. But it is amazing, if that clip is correct, to see him just in the most naked terms contradict, like, the whole point of really his very relatively, his totally boring and anodyne model. Like, yeah, people believe bad things, so they do bad things.
It's like it's the reverse fundamentalism model, where you take the written word of any sort of scripture as like exactly how fundamentalists would take it.
That is just, I'm sorry, I'm still actually blazing from that. Listening to Sam Harris, honestly, it doesn't surprise me, because the same way he's talking about white supremacy is exactly the same. He's using similar narrative structures he's always used, which is that he's an ahistorical essentialist thinker who is, he's probably more rooted in his own biases and less aware of them of literally anybody in public life. I actually cannot think of a similar person. But this is Sam Harris. Sam Harris talking about white supremacy-based terrorism reminds me of the old Onion headline where the president of the NRA is like, all right, we'll agree to do something about school shootings, but there has to be like 850 children killed. And I'm not talking injury. It has to be deaths. This is a guy who for years has said, you can erase thousands of years of human history. You don't need to know anything about politics, geography, anthropology, history. You don't need to just be a basic inquisitive human being and talk to a broad set of people. There's this book that I don't read in the original language. I've taken some inflammatory quotes from, and I've correlated it with a few polls whose methodology I probably don't even understand, and a couple of current events and all of my biases, and therefore there is Islam and terrorism, and that's it. And, here's a thought experiment about nuking them. Here he is talking about white supremacy.
So, take the case of McVeigh, right? So we all know what it's like to see a white supremacist on television and, interviewed or given an opportunity to state his views, and they're not shy about stating these views.
That's a very dubious thing to say about white supremacists on TV, that maybe we should return to later.
Indeed.
On television and, interviewed or given an opportunity to state his views, and they're not shy about stating these views. They're proud of their racism, right? They want to use the platform to further spread these ideas. And we know what those vile chatterboxes are like. And then you have someone like McVeigh who, if he expressed any racism, I'm sure, there are things in his backstory that suggest he was racist, but I recently watched the one interview he gave from death row for 60 Minutes. And he didn't express anything like that there. And when given an opportunity to account for what he had done, he put it in terms that were really entirely focused on the misapplication of state power. I mean, he said, unlike the example you gave of the veteran who said, I killed communists over there, and why not kill them here? He gave a certainly less white supremacist gloss on what he had done. He said, listen, I was in Iraq and I killed people over there and I got medals for it. But, what was I doing over there killing people? That wasn't...
It's just so disingenuous because, first of all, yes, McVeigh read the Turner Diaries, which is a quintessential white terrorism, white supremacist text, right? But also...
Maybe the most famous one
Maybe
in America?
the most famous one. So, of course, Mr. You just have to read the hadiths doesn't do the basic background checks there. But actually, there's many interviews with Timothy McVeigh, and for whatever reason, yes, Timothy McVeigh has never emphasized a racial dimension of what he does. So what he's doing is he's ignoring the most salient piece of evidence and then just basically picking somebody who certainly would fit under right-wing anti-governmental terrorism, but was not racially fixated the same way you could talk about, as an example, the guy who shot up and murdered the people at the Sikh Gurdwara, as an example. So it doesn't even...
Well, this is like when he saw an interview with Tommy Robinson. He's like, well, you got to admit that interview was unobjectionable,
everything he
right?
said in that interview was reasonable. And of course, as we all know, proper intellectual work means that you never read the context, history, or setting for anything.
Anyway,
and if you do, that's unfair.
Ballou comes in here.
Now, McVeigh... So there's a couple of, let me just start with what we know about him. And I'll just start with a methodological distinction, which is historians a lot of the time really distrust what people say about something after the fact. We prefer to see what they did. And McVeigh's life gives us some evidence that his, public comments sort of don't show, including, as you mentioned, his affiliation with the Michigan militia. He also wrote letters to his sister saying he was going underground and encouraging her to continue above ground activism, and he was going to sort of go off the grid. He had attempted contacts with a whole bunch of different white power groups, including the Arizona Patriots, the National Alliance, which, by the way, is the one headed by the man who wrote the Turner Diaries, and the separatist compound at Elohim City, which had sheltered a whole bunch of people on the lam who were members of the Order and other white power terrorist groups that were organized in leaderless resistance style. He chose the date of the bombing on the anniversary of the Waco siege. That's pretty well known, but also on the execution date of a prominent white power activist who had once targeted that same building in Oklahoma City.
Yeah, I just want to say, all I know about this podcast, and I don't know much about Kathleen Ballou, although I think she's a real historian. So props to Harris for having a real historian on.
She was on MR. She was good.
I don't remember that.
It was a vacation show.
Oh, okay. I do see, though, I think Ina from Polite Conversations, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I believe she tweeted out that apparently Sam said in one of his laborious, those 1,000-minute introductions or something, where he's just but before we get to it, somebody tweeted that, something, blah, 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 that Kathleen Ballou was pretty woke, and that next week he'd be talking with Barry White.
Yeah, he said that after the interview.
That's amazing, though. You talk to an actual historian who is able to just not even argue with you, but just be yeah, basically, Sam, you're literally missing all salient information here. And then it's just yeah, I don't know. But next week I'll be talking to a brain dead moron from the New York Times.
Where does Sam get off saying that white supremacists are strictly forthright about their views on media? I think we should do an impromptu Hitchens throwback here when he had Tom Metzger on.
Oh, I like it.
Here's just a part of it. This whole thing is actually very good, but this part is funny.
If Hitchens could have redeemed, not entirely, because he's got he does, if we're being real, between Afghanistan and Iraq, he has a lot of blood and he enabled a lot of stuff, but he did a lot of great things too, and he was a charm and a raconteur. And if he was alive and was just here to bully Sam Harris, he would be making up a lot of ground.
So you don't care? In other words, so if you were told it was true, you wouldn't say the person saying so was a liar and a prisoner of Jewish propaganda.
I doubt.
You're not even a Holocaust revisionist.
Well, history is not history anymore. It's by special lobbyist groups that come in and try to knock each other to get certain ideas in. So the fact that they spend so much time on the issue is questionable in itself.
Will you allow me to say, abuse my privilege and say I'm a bit disappointed? I was kind of looking forward to this, and now you're disappointing me. You don't seem to have the cowardice of your convictions, or courage is perhaps the word I mean.
Let's set the
Look, we've got your
higher.
father on the line, who's said to be a real tough guy. Mr. Metzger Sr., can we get you in with us?
Yeah, sure. Very clever.
How do you think the boy's shaping up?
Well, you're a very clever interrogator, sort of a second best Bill Buckley, but you're trying. I mean, you
certainly know how to hurt a guy, I'll say that for a start. I was wondering how you thought the boy was doing.
Hitler. I mean, is there anything else in the world besides Jews to talk about?
Cuffed his father,
as I said, to your firstborn, if that's what he is, anyway, your son, Mr. Metzger. It's a question that need only be asked once, as long as it's answered. Would you accept that as fair?
But what question is this?
If you force me to restate it, you can't complain it keeps coming up, can you? I want to know, since your organization simultaneously says the Holocaust is a myth, but appears to support those who think it was a jolly good thing, which of those two things you think yourself?
Well, what we have said is an exaggerated, the figures are exaggerated, and the facts are showing that to be true as each year passes by. But our concern is with the third world invasion of this nation.
In other words, not forthright. Right. He had to bring his dad on, and his dad was a little bit more forthright and still not there.
Yeah, but still a punk and still not what they're saying behind the scenes. Exactly, which is another reason that the idea that you like listening, because I listened to Polite Conversations with Ayaan, her like longer term dissection of this, and she plays like Sam Harris being like legitimate, like, and always like, I hate Trump, but basically like I hate Trump because he's dumb, right? Like the most superficial and just like wanky reason to not like
aesthetic
Trump, right?
Reasons.
It's all aesthetics, and then and he'll say that he's immoral or whatever, but then like really be like, you know, it's like we need to dissect whether or not telling the woman in the squad to go home was actually.
He goes on to say, and maybe he says it in here, and I don't want to jump that, where he says like, there's some things you don't say in public. Is that the part of it? And at one point he says, and we'll play some more of this, but at one point he says, you know, it's one thing for you not to get the vaccine. It's a personal choice, and you know, it is what it is. But it's another to go out there and ostensibly ruminate about this stuff. There's some things you do not say in public.
As a broadcaster.
As a broadcaster, whatever.
Somebody with influence.
And maybe I'm extrapolating, but you also don't say it in public because of context, right? That public is not just in terms of how many people can hear it. It also is the circumstance of the public at that time. It's one thing to say 10 years from now, ivermectin, we should look into. Or 5 years ago to talk about ivermectin might be something that people would have, you know, obviously. But when you say it now, and you talk about it in the context of everything that's going on politically.
Now, like post-vaccine, where ivermectin is not just ivermectin, it is the solution that is used is deployed to convince people that the vaccine is unnecessary. This all is important. Now, so I want you to listen to this last part, and I want you to just keep in mind what I've just said about context, because I am here not only to praise, but all right, so go. Do you want to go to 1955?
Go to 1955.
No matter how reasonable and attentive to caveats they can seem, and I will grant you, they can seem incredibly reasonable. They do not seem like Alex Jones. And this is why what they're doing is so insidious. And from what I've seen recently, the data in favor of ivermectin seems increasingly dubious. So parsing all this should be left to the professionals, right? Again, I come back to my basic mystification around what Bret and Heather are doing. Why do this publicly? If you're going to make the personal choice not to get vaccinated based on your scrutiny of the data, great, make that choice. But why spend the better part of a year convincing people that they shouldn't get vaccinated? You can say that's not what you're doing, but that is in fact what you're doing. And that's what seems so irresponsible. The U.S. is now one of the least vaccinated countries in the developed world.
He goes on to say we are one of the least vaccinated countries in the developed world, and how dangerous this is. Now, there's 2 points here that I want to make, and again, credit where credit's due. Someone just IM'd this, and this really is the point I was going to make. My brain hurts going from the last 5 years or so of Sam Harris to a man who all of a sudden understands the implications of his arguments could be negatively appropriated to society at large, or that honest debate can be weaponized by the disingenuous to toxify the discourse. And so this was my argument with Sam, whatever it was, 5 or 6 years ago, when, and he has since written in 2011, in 2006, I think it was, he wrote In Defense of Torture. That was the title of the piece that he wrote at Huffington Post, In Defense of Torture. It may have been an appropriation from his book. 2011, he addresses, I should have never written about this in my book. He never really actually talks about the In Defense of Torture at the Huffington Post. But nevertheless, and he says, and he basically says, I shouldn't do it because people misconstrued it, blah, blah, blah. But my point was always this: in the middle of a debate on torture that this country was having at that time, to do this thought experiment, which incidentally, the hypothetical is also a conspiracy in this way. There is never a situation where a president or an FBI person, can know that there's a ticking time bomb. It is simply, they make a judgment that it is worth it for me to torture. And he says, I'm not saying it should be legal, but it is ethical. I don't even know what that means. Because is it ethical to do an act that's going to have broader implications within his hypothetical? FBI tortures a guy, then it basically unleashes the ability of other FBI guys who are convinced that there is another bomb that they're going to torture. You can't just isolate it to that one situation in the real world, even in the hypothetical. But then introducing this question into a broader context in which there is a debate about torture, you are doing something you cannot deny.
Well, he's using the veneer of credibility by being philosophical to basically talk about a 24 scenario where there's a bomb ticking and what do you do? I mean, that was the famous debate there, and it's just so divorced from reality, but serves the function that you're exactly saying, to uphold those systems which are inherently immoral and then also racist. Talk about his bigger project, right, which I'm sure you will in a second. But what he did, talking about how Islamic ideology is fundamentally more violent or inherently more violent than other ideologies, he didn't take into the broader context, or he didn't fit his argument into the broader context of what was being done in this country at the time, which was the war on terror was, I don't remember exactly when he had these when he came to the fore, but it was in the heights of the war on terror. So his entire rise to fame, the reason that he has a public platform, was because he provided an acceptable face and an acceptable low NPR-like tone to talk about these very racist policies as if they were acceptable. It wasn't just torture; it was broader Islamophobia.
That is true, and I think the problems I have with his positions on Islam are slightly different from this, because I think what he's talking about right here, though, with what Bret Weinstein's doing, by sort of nibbling around the edges, is what he was doing with torture. And on some level he was doing, I guess, with Islamophobia, in that he's providing, I think you're right.
Well, what he says is the problem is with Bret is it's so insidious because he has the aesthetics of reason, and he has all this attention to caveats and stuff like that. But that's the exact same thing, is because the reason of what Bret is saying is the vaccines aren't safe. The reason of what was behind what Sam was saying is Muslims are dangerous.
Yes. I mean, literally you can see Sam has sections of his blog that were dedicated to the cats. Yeah. But it is the primary thrust of what you're delivering, the caveats notwithstanding. And then the other thing I should also say is that it is and I don't want to be petty here, but on one hand, you have a guy, and he's calling these proclamations that Bret and Heather are doing insane. I think he said at one point. Think about what the implications of these are. Has one person died because? I mean, didn't we do a story about like that?
We know of one.
Yeah, at least one.
They didn't get the vaccine. They ended up dying. Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 100? Is it 1,000? I don't know. Does it need to be more than one? And he's still going to be, and he's not going to do a personal attack. This guy said that I was displaying psychopathic behavior. But the bottom line is, good for Sam Harris. It is, again, I mean, I think we told you, but you didn't listen. So there it is. I mean, this is, I hope that lesson, in the event that Sam Harris ever finds himself in that situation again where he wants to start doing hypotheticals about hot button political issues,